Hello, and welcome to the course. I'm your host today, Stephen, and I'm speaking with Professor Christopher Campos of the Booth School of Business. Professor Campos is an assistant professor of economics and Buehler Junior Faculty Fellow who received his PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and did a postdoc as a research associate with the Industrial Relations section at Princeton. Before attending college, he did multiple tours of duty in the U.S. Marine Corps. He's here to talk to us today about his career path and how he became a University of Chicago professor. Professor Campos, welcome to the course. How are you doing today?
Doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. Got a lot to get to, but let's just get some of the basics out of the way first. Can you just tell us, what your position is right now at U Chicago, and a little bit in layman's terms about what it is that you study?
Yeah, so I just started as an assistant professor of economics at Chicago Booth this past July, so I'm roughly 3 months in. I am trained as a labor economist. I got my PhD at UC Berkeley. Most of my research right now focuses on topics related to human capital. So for example, some of my research studies or demonstrates how subtle changes to education markets can lead to substantial changes in the educational trajectories of students in the K through 12 setting. And to better understand why that is, some of my other work seeks to kind of experimentally understand how families are choosing schools and the implications those choices have for the success of other market-oriented reforms in the education space. So that's just some of my work now, but I also do other stuff related to human capital in South America and the United States.
Okay, cool. And yeah, we're going to delve into that a little bit more. But first, let's delve into your own bio. Could you just take us through sort of step by step, starting in college and going up through now? What different institutions have you attended? What different roles have you had? Just give us an overview of your journey to U Chicago.
Yeah, so I actually started at community college after I got out of the military. I went to Los Angeles Pierce College and Santa Monica Community College in the LA County area. Then I transferred to UC San Diego, where I majored in statistics and economics. And then right after that, I went straight to do a PhD in economics at UC Berkeley. Then after that, I did a postdoc with the IR section at Princeton University. And now I'm here at the University of Chicago as an assistant professor. So that was my journey. It feels rather long as I go through all the institutions.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you to go even further back to when you were in, like middle or high school. Can you tell us like a little bit about what you were like and what you thought you would end up doing? I mean, did you have any idea that you were going to end up being an economist or even end up joining the military? Like, what did you think you were going to do?
Yeah, like no way. Like not even when I started college did I think I would end up as an academic or even studying economics. So, I mean, for me, when I was younger, I think I was roughly 10, 11 years old. 9/11 happened, had a big impact in my life and kind of changed my perception about like what I wanted to do with my life. So it immediately made me want to join the military. Also, just because I hadn't quite figured out what I wanted to do right after high school. I also kind of grew up in a neighborhood where most people like go to community college and then they go to community college and they get a job and then they drop out of community college. So for me, it really felt like I needed to leave home to be able to do something successful in the future. At least it was the path forward that I thought would lead to the most success. So the military was going to serve that role as allowing me to leave and kind of figure things out. And so, I think, yeah, so the military was kind of like my mindset following 9/11. And then after kind of when I got to college, yeah, I still would have never imagined to end up in academia, but I had an amazing undergraduate advisor. His name's Ross Starr at UC San Diego, who really framed economics to me from a different perspective. But not only did he change kind of how I perceived economics as a field, he was also really inspirational and kind of really nudging me into writing a senior thesis, into working on whatever I wanted, and then just kind of really nudging me to apply to top graduate programs. And then I think behind the scenes also really supporting me and making sure I got into a good graduate program. So I think like getting me into graduate school, a lot of it is Ross Starr and kind of the type of activities I got involved in at UCSD, but I think he's kind of like the inspiration of all of that. So I have a lot. I have a lot of gratitude for Ross.
Yeah. So did you know before that you were interested in economics, or like what drew you to the field initially?
Yeah, not really, actually. So I was actually majoring in computer science. And so, I got to college and, I had never written a line of code in my life. And I was doing well in the computer science classes, but I just really was aggravated that I was competing with other students who've been coding since they were 5 years old. And them, some of the things we were working on, they've been doing since they were like 10. So then I switched to math and kind of in taking an elective mathematical econ class. That's when I met Ross and kind of got introduced to economics. And then I kind of really liked it. And it was a more theoretical introduction because Ross is a theorist. But yeah, and I think his mentorship and guidance following that really influenced me kind of getting into economics and taking other courses and seeing what the field is really about. So that was kind of the turning point for me.
Yeah, so like obviously that influence was huge, as you said, not only in your interest in grad school, but also in where you ended up. But like, what was it for you that made you decide I really do want to pursue this at the graduate level?
Yeah. So, I wrote a senior thesis and then I was working as a research assistant for other graduate students and professors at UCSD. And I really just love the research process. And in particular, just the joy you get from figuring things out. So, like in doing research, you're like confused or unsure of what you're really doing a majority of the time. But just, like that joy you get from actually figuring something out or coming across a novel finding, like to me, like it just outweighs like kind of all of the frustration involved with the research process. So kind of just those little nuggets of joy is something I really came to embrace and like. And from that moment forward, like moving forward, I knew that I wanted to do research and that grad school was probably a good option for me moving forward just because I really liked it.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. Can you think of a moment like that? I mean, maybe from your earlier years, but maybe there's a recent one. I don't know. But like you described the feeling of, research, just having kind of no idea what's going on and then having like an aha moment. I don't know. Was there an early one of those that inspired you or a recent example that you can think of?
Yeah, I guess like yeah, let me kind of think. I mean, let me just give you kind of a maybe a more common experience that others will kind of definitely kind of connect with. I'm an empirical kind of or an applied economist, so I do a lot of empirical work. And before kind of doing any of the empirical work, it involves a lot of data cleaning and kind of planning out how to structure your data set and how you're going to do analysis. And that process is really aggravating. It's kind of lengthy, but it's the most important part of the process because, if that's done incorrectly, then kind of nothing that follows is going to be right.
Yeah.
And so you can be at this phase for like a month or two, just all about cleaning data, preparing the data. And I think like some kind of really amazing moments is like once you're done with all of that,
Mhm.
you start doing kind of the first pieces of analysis and like you come across like some really interesting findings that maybe are counterintuitive or extremely thought provoking. Like that is definitely kind of like you get so much joy from that, because you just spent like a month or two, or maybe even longer in some cases where people spent years kind of putting data sets together, things like that. And then you kind of finally get to the point where you get to find out like the answer to what you've been uh, like the answer you've been seeking for so many years or months, however long it is. And then once you see it, like, I don't know, it's just such a rewarding moment that I think everyone that does empirical work probably feels.
Yeah, that's a great description. Before we get into your current work further, I just wanted to stop and ask about unlike I think everyone else that we've interviewed for this podcast so far, you were in the military for several years before going to undergrad. So like are there direct influences from that part of your life that you see in your work, or like how do you think your years in the military influence you as an academic now?
Yeah, like I think the time in the military really helped because I think like in academia, you have to have a lot of perseverance and just a willingness to just work through like a lot of like periods where we're just like consistently taking a lot of L's for lack of a better term. And military is just all about that. Like I think
Yeah.
you kind of learn to really embrace morale, like kind of keep your morale up through like tough times. And in that sense, it's really helped. Also in academia, like people have a lot of differing perspectives about the way research should be done or how to approach different questions. So, a lot of the job involves disagreeing with people,
Hmm.
right? Being able to hold your own. In the military, you kind of learn to do that just because, as some academics can be very aggressive and be somewhat off putting, but it's like nowhere near as bad as how it is in the military. So like in that sense, it's like really shielded me or protected me
Yeah.
because I see some of my other colleagues who, obviously certain comments can really do a lot of damage. And in my case, I'm just like, I can more easily brush it off.
Yeah, you get a lot of practice receiving criticism, I would imagine.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's funny. All right. I mean that's actually like a really funny comparison. I don't know. Are there any aspects of your current job that are similar to your military experience, or do you feel like you're in a just completely different world now?
Yeah. I mean, I think the only similarity really, which is not a similarity at all, is that both the military and academia, it's like its own bubble, like it's just the norms are entirely different. People just are different. They think differently. There's just absolutely like very little overlap between the two bubbles, but they just operate in their own way. And it's very different in the sense that in the military, you're consistently around people and camaraderie is a big thing.
Mm.
Academia is a very solitary job. Like you're always alone for the most part. You obviously can talk to a lot of colleagues, and that at Booth we do. Like everyone is always down to talk, brainstorm through things. But for the most part, you're by yourself. So in that sense, it's very different.
Yeah, how do you handle that? I mean, like, do you find that you need to seek people out sometimes, in the course of your work, or yeah, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, no, you definitely do. Like I think at Booth, like what's really nice is that people are always kind of up for talking about your work. They actually always want to hear about what you're working on. In contrast to some other places I visited where kind of people are somewhat more reserved. So I definitely, anytime I have like an important enough question, I'll reach out to my senior colleagues. I'll usually start with my junior colleagues, kind of just bounce ideas off of them.
Mm.
And then once something's ready, I go and talk to my senior colleagues, and they're always super supportive and helpful, and kind of just provide different perspectives about how to approach different problems or ideas that I'm thinking of. So yeah, it's definitely a collaborative process in that sense. But for the most part, I would say like 90% of the time you're like alone working on whatever you are. But there is like, I don't know, I'm just making this up, like 10% of the time you are kind of talking and brainstorming with other people, talking through ideas and getting feedback and things like that.
Yeah, and I would also imagine that your work is a whole lot less structured
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Extremely. It's the most flexible job ever.
Glad to hear that. And that leads right to what my next question was, which is just what is a sort of, if there is one, what is a typical day like for you? Like what is taking up your time on it's an average day?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think let me just kind of go through its standard day.
Sure.
Probably like get to the office, kind of 1 hour worth of just answering emails that I either received in the past 24 hours or I'm somewhat behind on. So I'm usually constantly just playing catch up on that end, but try to do that
Mhm.
first thing in the morning. Then I really try to give myself like 3 or 4 hours to really like dive into something that is important in terms of like whatever research project I'm currently working on, whether that involves coding or reading a paper that's related to something that I'm doing. But I always try to give myself 3 to 4 hours on most mornings to really get through that. And then after that, that's kind of when I start scheduling. I may have calls that are scheduled with either partners I'm working with, talking about logistics of different projects or planning different projects, chatting with collaborators about progress on other projects. But for the most part, it's like half of my day, like 3 to 4 or 5 hours, is really me trying to concentrate on something that I think is important for whatever I'm working on. And then obviously communicating with other people about whatever other projects I have ongoing. So I think that tends to be the typical day. I'm like an applied person, so a lot of my work involves collaborating with other governmental agencies or kind of policymakers. A theorist, I imagine, has a very different day-to-day experience.
Yeah, I've spoken with a few, and I think they do. But I wanted to ask you if you could just like go into a little bit more detail about what that collaboration looks like. Like when you're undertaking a project either with another academic or like with someone in the government, what does that research actually entail?
Yeah, so I can tell you about some of the stuff that I've done with the Los Angeles Unified School District, just because I've been working with them for, I guess, almost 5 years now. So I guess my work with them kind of started off as me being a freelancer and just offering some services, some consulting like services, and just investigating some things with some of the data they had, and really just being like kind of an asset to them. And as I kind of developed their trust, I felt more comfortable pitching ideas that I thought may be interesting to them and may somehow indirectly also benefit the district. And so at least my collaboration with them now kind of involves me exploring particular ideas that are related to research questions I'm interested in, but they typically always have to have a spin around somehow benefiting the district in one way or the other. And sometimes I do have to be somewhat creative in kind of how I pitch ideas, because the academic question I may be after may be entirely different from what they care about, but in a weird way, there's overlap, and these questions can like coexist, or these projects can coexist. But the reports that I'll write up for the district in terms of the questions they're interested in will be very different from what the academic paper actually ends up discussing.
And just to clarify, where were you academically at the time that you reached out to them and started doing this research? Because I mean, I think it's interesting that you said, you sort of just reached out like as a freelancer.
Yeah, I was in graduate school, so I was calling a lot of school districts and just trying to kind of introduce myself. But as a graduate student, they don't really want to talk to you. Like these like policymakers or stakeholders have other important things they're working on, and they don't always have the capacity to take on some of these projects. But I was a graduate student, and I think my strategy at the time was, okay, like obviously I'm not that important to them, but let me find someone in the chain of command who's like high enough, but not that high. And my reasoning was, if you go too high, like sure, they can greenlight a lot of things, but they'll probably ghost you, and then if they end up ghosting you, the project essentially dies. So you need someone who's somewhat motivated, who has some power, who's willing to take on this project, and is potentially going to like use these types of research projects as kind of a reason to get promoted or something like that. And
Right.
and so that was kind of my strategy, and kind of always trying to identify who that may be within the district. And I think I found the right partners in different places I've worked at, and it's kind of been successful in that sense. So that was my strategy.
That's interesting. I mean, because I feel like that would be probably applicable across a lot of fields, at least other social sciences. Like, you have to take into account the people who you want to work with, and then the areas you want to study. You have to take into account what they're after and what their goals are. Also, it's not
Exactly.
they don't all want to just be in an academic study.
For sure. Exactly that. And I think even more so as a graduate student, where, I think people are just less inclined to want to talk to you. So like as a professor, I think it's a lot easier to initiate these conversations, and maybe people up the chain are more willing to talk to you just because you're already kind of a professor somewhere or an assistant professor. But as a graduate student, I thought it was much more challenging. Like now I'm finding it a lot more easier to initiate these conversations with different like kind of policymakers and stuff. So it's definitely something that works as a graduate student, but works in general as well, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, cool. I'm glad to hear that. And yeah, in your new role as an assistant professor, one thing that we've been asking everybody is just what is the most fun about what you do, and what aspects of your job do you personally find the least enjoyable?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay. I guess the most fun for sure is I get to interact and talk to really interesting people working on really thought-provoking things every day. When I go and have lunch, there'll be like Nobel laureates there sometimes. And, just having access to people who are just working on things that are kind of trying to change the world or make it a better world is really amazing. So I love that aspect of my job. It's also really great that, in the same way I like talking to people or kind of embrace their ideas, they also want to hear about what I'm working on. And that involves me going and giving talks at different universities, traveling to really interesting and cool places of the world to kind of just exchange ideas with other academics. Like that is kind of what makes academia so great, I think. It's just this constant flow of ideas and exchange of ideas, and everyone is genuinely interested in hearing about each other's work. And that to me is the best part of the job. And so in terms of what I hate or dislike the most, that's a good question. So I think at Chicago Booth, I'm at a very special place where, from my understanding, they really protect the time of the junior professors or the assistant professors, in that we're not asked to do a lot of service compared to other assistant professors at other top economics departments, for example. So in that sense, a lot of the stuff that I think assistant professors at my stage would be complaining about, we just don't have to deal with that booth. So we're very lucky. Like I don't have to teach my first 2 years. Not that teaching is bad, but it also takes away time from doing research, which is our primary objective.
Mhm.
I don't have to do any other additional services for the school. So in that sense, I really don't have that much to complain about. I guess. But if I did have to complain about something, let me see. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. This isn't particular to Chicago Booth, but when you start doing work that kind of is impacting kind of the lives of different families, sometimes your work can be interpreted incorrectly,
Hmm.
and people can form perceptions about what you're doing that are entirely wrong. And I bring that up because that recently happened with a project. And so I don't know, like once your work starts getting out there, people are obviously going to interpret it in ways that you didn't intend them to. And that's just going to be part of the job, I think, because people are free to interpret things however they want. And it sucks when that happens sometimes, I think.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I mean, it's nice that it took you a minute to come up with something bad. That's always a good sign.
Yeah,
But that's actually, I hadn't heard that yet, but I imagine that if we went back and interviewed previous guests on the show, a lot of them would have had a similar experience where, yeah, well, once your work goes out into the world, you can't control the reaction.
exactly.
Well, let's just talk for a little bit about your current research and where it might be going. Like, can you just sort of in a nutshell, and you described this earlier, but tell us about what is the focus of the research that you're doing now, and are there any questions maybe stemming from that, or just other questions that you have that you are hoping to be able to look into in the future?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think like one of the most kind of pressing or kind of most policy relevant kind of questions in the K through 12 education space relates to kind of whether or not families and kids are better or worse off with school choice policies or school choice programs. And in particular, there's this recent rise in kind of using centralized assignment systems to allocate students to schools. So it's a kind of very well-defined way to allocate students to schools in kind of these district-wide or kind of intra-district-wide school choice policies. And there's been a lot of work done from a theoretical perspective on kind of what the right kind of rules for the algorithm should be, or kind of the different implications of different types of rules. But there's been very little evidence on how these types of systems actually impact the outcomes of students. Right. So you introduce these systems, it's unclear if it's actually going to change kind of the outcomes of the students who are affected by this policy. And the reason why that has been it's been challenging to do that is because when these policies are introduced, it's usually everyone gets it at the same time. And you can't really find a comparable group of students who are unaffected to kind of try to tease out like what the effects of these policies are. And so in some of my earlier work, I'm able to do that by studying the case of Los Angeles, which essentially introduced a form of school choice, a form of centralized assignment, and essentially half of the district, and the other half of the district was left unchanged. And then you're just able to kind of do some before and after comparisons and the trends of the achievement of the affected kids to the unaffected kids to try to kind of get at what the causal impact of these choice reforms are in the public school system. So this is all kind of public to public school choice and competition. And then, kind of adding a layer of assumptions, you can try to argue that a lot of what I'm finding, which was that this policy essentially eliminated achievement gaps between affected neighborhoods and unaffected neighborhoods. It eliminated four-year college enrollment gaps between the two groups of students. And then kind of we try to argue that competition is really playing a role. So schools that were going to face kind of significant amount of pressure to improve because students were going to leave once these school choice systems were introduced are actually the ones that improve the most. So this notion that competition can compel less effective schools to improve actually kind of was true in the case of Los Angeles, the zones of choice program.
That's interesting. And just to clarify, so these are the choices between different public schools in like the same district. Like you're talking about
Yeah.
competition between different public schools.
Yeah, between different public schools within the same neighborhood. So, let me be a little more precise about what happened in Los Angeles. So there was this program called the Zones of Choice program. And before it was expanded, There's neighborhood based assignments. So where you live, you're allocated a single school based on your address. And that's the one you go to, whether it be an elementary, middle school, or high school. What the Zones of Choice program did was create markets of schools. So instead of you now having one option to go to when you went to high school, you now had 3 options. And so you're essentially combining the catchment areas to create a zone of choice. And so now when it's time to transition between middle school and high school, instead of you just going to your assigned school, you can now submit an application. So you have choice, but it's not like universal choice in the sense that you can go to any school in the district. It's still restricted and it's neighborhood-based choice. And so it was just a subtle alteration to how these education markets were structured in Los Angeles. And it seemed to have produced such remarkable improvements, at least in Los Angeles. And so Los Angeles is also kind of the special case where we're able to document these very strong and positive impacts. And that may not be the case in other districts that implement these types of policies. So some of my follow-up work is really trying to understand the mechanisms that kind of can explain why this program was so successful.
Interesting. And yeah, I guess with any study like this, it sounds like you've learned a lot, and the evidence sounds convincing in this case. But is it sort of the case? It's like, well, now we have to look at a bunch of other cities and that all have their own unique systems and problems.
Exactly. So yeah, by no means would I argue that this type of system would work in New York City or other cities that could potentially introduce such a system. But there's a lot we can learn from these case studies that we can maybe take the best things out of this and then plug it into another setting and things like that.
Yeah, I have to say, as a New York City resident, I'd be very interested to see how that would go in New York. But I'll just move on to the final question here, which is simply, what is the most gratifying thing that you do in your field?
I think I alluded to this a bit earlier. I think the most gratifying moments are when you just figure something out after being stuck on it for weeks and months. I think exactly like the example I kind of gave earlier. If you're cleaning some data for like 1 to, I don't know, however months or years it takes to kind of prepare this data, you can finally get to the point where you can do some analysis to see like whether the hypotheses you had are right or wrong. That is kind of the most rewarding moment of the job. Unfortunately, like it doesn't always go like the right direction, or, you may spend like a year plus like cleaning some data and it turns out that all your hypotheses are wrong or there's just nothing there, which is also possible. So that happens quite often. But the times where that doesn't happen is just so rewarding. And it's really why we do this.
Thank you, Professor Campos, for your time today. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other ones, leave us a comment, subscribe, follow, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. Stay tuned for more. We'll see you around.